Prologue. The stink of blood and death was thick upon the plain. A crimson light tainted the sky, turning the midday sun into a smoldering ember behind the unnatural haze. Overhead, the croaking of vultures drifted down, like the impatient muttering of demons. Again and again the carrion bird circled, never descending, never departing. The reek of death had drawn them from their gruesome rookeries to linger until they had filled their scrawny frames with their hideous repast. A man stood upon a small hill, little more than a jagged pile of rocks cast down by the craggy mountains beyond the plain. Like the vultures, he waited for the sound to fade, the warrior's din of crashing steel and the screams of dying men. Unlike the vultures, he did not listen to the clamor with a mind greedy with hunger. He was no scavenger, no slinking jackal preying upon the leavings of true predators. The man stood with a pride alien to scavengers and ghouls. His frame was straight and tall, his limbs corded with iron knots of muscle, his chest swollen with strength. Armor of lacquered bone and boiled leather was fastened around his powerful body, blackened with soot to match the braided scalp locks that dripped from beneath his gold masked helm. A nest of spikes protruded from the rim of his helm, stabbing up at the crimson sky. Crafted from ruby, adorned in jade and obsidian, the crown that circled the demon mask helm was more than an affectation of a primitive savage, the boast of a barbarous warlord. It was a talisman of power, a display of authority and might. It was the heraldry of a king, and each of the spikes that jutted from its band betokened one who had stood against its wearer and been cut down by his sword. It was whispered that no mortal had crafted the crown, that it had come from the realm of chaos, and each time another fell to its wearer, it was no artisan who placed a new spike upon the ruby, upon the king's brow, but rather that the crown grew a new bloodthorn to commemorate the deed. Terror of the blood crown had spread through the shadowlands, passing in frightened mutterings between the horse clans of the Hung, the nomad tribes of the Kurgan, and the war herds of the Beastkin. The name of he who wore it had become a curse on the tongues of a dozen races. Teokte Khan, the glorious king of the savage. Unlike the Khans, who had led the war hosts of the Tong in the past, exploding into the Shadowlands in a storm of slaughter and pillage, Teokte had not led his people back into the forbidden vastness of the chaos wastes. The king had remained, and with him the savage, the most vicious tribe to ever emerge from the forsaken realm of the Tong. Teokte's eyes closed in thought behind the snarling mask of his helm. He saw again the bloody dream that had drawn him to the wastes, into a land where the breath of the gods was a calm breeze rather than a raging tempest. Here, the bloody dream had been cast aside, old oaths and pacts forgotten. Here, a new dream had been forged, cast in the iron of Teokte's indomitable will. Not the dreams of endless slaughter, but the visions of timeless empire. By his might, by his power, Teokte had conquered the plains and bound the steppes to him with chains of terror. Now, it was not only the Tong who swore allegiance to him, but the tribes of the Kurgan, the Hung, and the Beastkin. Other warlords had forged such war hosts, great hordes as vast as the horizon, and they had squandered their power in campaigns of carnage, spending their strength in the vainglorious effort to appease the ever hungry gods. Teokte had a different vision. He saw a land crushed in his iron fist. He saw castles and fortresses rising from the dust of the steppes, mines stabbing into the deeps of the mountains, fields exploding across the forsaken plains. He saw a land reforged in his own image, a dominion that would become stronger than the steel that built it. This would be his glory and his legacy, not the empty quest to appease the capricious gods. His name forgotten in the murk of time. The domain he built would endure long after he was gone. And, through his legacy, would outlast the gods. He had forged powerful alliances with the strongest tribes, gifting their chieftains with mighty demon weapons in exchange for their oaths of blood and loyalty. His was an army such as the Shadowlands had never seen, a horde of a conqueror, the horde of a king. The roar of battle drew nearer. Teote's eyes snapped open, his armored hand closing around the sword at his side. With a shrill hiss, he drew the blade from its scabbard of flesh, the flayed husk of Teote's first victim. The sword burned like scarlet fire in his hand, fat and crooked. A ripple of lightning captured in crimson steel. Teote felt himself being drawn into the flickering embers that burned within the blade. The Khan pulled his eyes away, sneering at the greedy malice of the Blood Eater. The blade had feasted upon many souls since the hour it had been forged, but it would never taste that of Teote. The warlord stroked the sharp edge, letting it scrape against the iron of his gloves, teasing the weapon's malignancy with the nearness of his blood. Angered, the Blood Eater would be even more deadlier in the battle. Eager to feed its frustration with death and ruin, Teote wanted the weapon at its most malevolent. He feared that the battle to come would test its hostility to the full. A choking death rattle rose sharply from the crimson mist, a hulking shape, little more than a shadow, through the curtain of gory fog, pitched and fell, its head rolling free from its shoulders. Dimly through the veil of mist, Teote seen mangled heaps of flesh strewn across the ground, scarcely human in their butchered ruin. Piled in heaps of broken bone and severed limbs, amid the wreckage, he could see a handful of warriors still standing, stubbornly refusing to abandon the fight. Two scarred Kurgan warriors lunged deeper into the crimson murk, monstrous axes clenched firmly in their fists. A breath later, Teote heard their screams, heard the sound of sizzling flesh and the liquid splash of blood upon the earth. The Khan dared a glance down at the Blood Eater, reassuring to find that its fire still burned steadily, a visible token of its smoldering fury.
What has come for you can be vanquished, but never destroyed.
Those had been the words of the old savage shaman, had muttered as he looked up from the puddled entrails of his sacrifice. No warning from the gods? A threat? No. Teote had taken it as a challenge. He knew which of the dark gods had sent this creature to ravage his domain. He knew that it would not relent until he had faced it in combat. Vanquished, but never destroyed, Teote sneered at the prophecy. The shaman had paid for his cryptic words, his skull smashed beneath the foot of a savage war mammoth. The man made his own destiny. He did not need the riddles of the gods to lead him astray. Man, monster, or demon, Teote had yet to encounter anything that could survive the Blood Eater's ravenous bite. The clamor of battle faded into a metal echo. Only the moans of the dying and the croaking vultures disturbing the silence. The crimson mist swelled, billowing as though moving by an unfelt wind. The rolling curtain stretched towards the hill, where Teote stood alone. The Khan had forbidden any of his warriors to stand with him. Whatever creature had crawled down from his domain from the wastes, he would face it alone. If he was victorious, it would reaffirm his might in the eyes of his chieftains, bind them all the more to his will. If he fell, it would not matter if 1,000 fell with him. Teote allowed only 400 Kurgan, who stood beneath the hill, to stand against the beast. If 400 could not stop the monster, no number of mortal warriors and mortal blades would. Teote would not squander the strength of his horde in useless conflict. It would matter little if he destroyed the monster at the expense of his army. No. If the horde was broken, death upon the creature's blade would only be too welcome. The Skull Taker. That was the name the thing had been given. The title it wore in nightmares of sorcerers and seers. The harbinger of Khorne. The blood god's chosen executioner. It had left a trail of destruction across Teocte's realm. Empty villages and broken castles. The Khan's realm was threatened, not by the Skulltaker, but by the terror he brought with him. If Teocte were to maintain his rule, he could allow his people to fear nothing more than they feared their king. At the base of the hill, the crimson mist rolled back, retreating as though pulled away by spectral steeds. As the mist retreated, a lone figure stood revealed beneath the baleful sky. Teocte was surprised to see that his adversary was no demon, no misshapen monster from the pits of the wastes. The figure that stood below was that of a man. But such a man, even the Khan had never faced before. Tall, bulky, his body was covered in plates of steel, stained the hue of old blood. A tattered cloak of demon fur spilling down his back, his head unseen behind a skull-faced helm of iron. Great antlers rose from either side of the helm, jagged horns of bronze, each forming one part of the skull rune of Khorne. Beside the malice Teocte could feel emanating from the lone warrior. Even the fury of the Blood Eater seemed a feeble thing. The king tried to stare into the skull-faced mask, to see the man behind the iron, but only shadow returned his gaze. A twinge of fear worked through the warlord's body. This, he knew, was a Skull Taker. And for the first time, he truly wondered if his foe could be destroyed. Could anything overcome such pure, raw hatred? The Skull Taker stood for a moment, letting his enemy take his measure. Then, slowly, his head lifted, staring back at Teocte. The warrior's voice growled from behind the mask, the sound of steel scraping against bone.
Doom!
The Skull Taker proclaimed.
Doom has come to the betrayers!
The warrior raised his weapon, a thick blade with jagged, cruel edges, as black as a shard of midnight. Teocte could see faces screaming beneath the black skin of the weapon, writhing in torment within the blade that had consumed their souls. The Khan looked down at his own sword, new doubt working into his mind. There was a kinship between these weapons, but that could not be. Neither man nor demon could have forged another such blade. Teocte bit down his fears. He was Teocte Khan, the greatest warlord to rise from the Tong, the mightiest people the world would ever know. No foe had ever bested him in battle. No foe ever would. Men could break their promises, but the word of a god was eternal. Whatever he was, whatever had sent him. The Skull Taker would fall before the Blood Eater and become another thorn upon the blood crown. Doom, he sneered. I fear no doom. You think to bring me death? Know that Teocte Khan cannot fall in battle. The blood god's oath protects me. He will not revoke his word when it is given. Doom? The king laughed at his silent foe. It is your doom that has come, wretch. The tale of the Skull Taker ends upon my Blood Eater.